Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast. I'm Dave Schratweiser. This week, we're going to talk about the incoming mayor, Cherelle Parker, the outgoing mayor, Jim Kenney, and a new police commissioner, and a whole bunch of issues that go with that. And we brought my good friend from Fox 29 on, Fox 29 political analyst, Bruce Gordon. Bruce and I worked together for 20 plus years at Fox. Bruce, thanks for coming back on the show. I appreciate it.
Always my pleasure, Dave.
Bruce, let's start. We're going to be about a week out when this airs. Cherelle Parker comes in, Jim Kenney goes out, and Cherelle comes in with a bag of tricks worth of problems to deal with, especially the crime issue and new police commissioner, stuff like that. But first, your thoughts on her taking office. Kind of give me your general view about what you're thinking about how she'll lead this city.
Well, look, she ran a very solid campaign, a very strong campaign in a crowded field of really legitimate contenders. These weren't just a bunch of gadflies saying, hey, I'll take a run at being mayor. These were some legitimate candidates. She ran a very strong campaign. But now comes the hard part, right? The best feeling in the world is that period from election night to about early January when you are the mayor-elect, and nothing beats being a mayor-elect. And once they take that hyphen and elect off, and you've got the real job, and it's just you in the executive office, the proverbial corner office, everything changes. There will be a bit of a honeymoon period. And, the fact that she is the first woman of color, the first woman, period, to be mayor of Philadelphia as the city's 100th mayor, means that some folks will give her a little bit of an extra runway, if you will, to make some early mistakes. Others will be looking at her even more harshly than they might if it was a man. And, you could debate that subject ad nauseum. But the bottom line is she gets at least a little bit of a honeymoon period. But there are some, as we both know, some really intractable problems in the city of Philadelphia that she's going to have to deal with. Crime being one of them, schools being another, housing, the epidemic of drug abuse and addiction in the city, and the poverty that has always been sort of a foundation for whatever anyone tries to do in that office. So it's going to be a challenge. Yeah,
as you said, when you get handed the keys to that office and you sit behind the desk for the first time and it's real, there's a pile on your desk of things to deal with. But I did think she came out of the box really well, sitting down and making her choice for police commissioner right off the bat. She has kind of given the air, I think, during the campaign and election night when she won. And then with that move that I'm in charge, I'm not afraid to be in charge, and I'm not afraid to push forward strongly right at the beginning.
Yeah, and she's also made very clear that her view, for example, of policing is not necessarily going to please the most left-leaning folks within the Democratic Party. But she made no bones about what she supports and what she wants to see in a police commissioner and in her police department writ large. And so we'll see how that plays. I think what kind of gets lost in the sauce sometimes when you're talking about issues like policing and crime fighting and your choice of police commissioner is that some of these issues, quite frankly, seem to be they change, they get better, they get worse at about a 30,000-foot level. There are national trends all over the place, and sometimes you are the beneficiary of good timing and sometimes not so good timing. It's no secret that about 10, 12 years ago, and I guess this would have been the time period when Charles Ramsey would have been police commissioner, the murder numbers, and that's sort of the big metric that everybody talks about all the time, those numbers were lower than they'd been in quite some time. And so Commissioner Ramsey gets a lot of the credit for that. Well, the fact is the numbers were going down around the country. In the city of New York, for example, the numbers were nosediving there, and that's obviously great news. But the fact is some of these issues are so big and so out of the control of one person, one police commissioner, that sometimes it's a function of timing. Now, the good news in Philadelphia, at least in relative terms, is those murder numbers have come down pretty significantly. Still way too high, still higher than they had been, but probably going to end up the year, the last time I checked, somewhere around 20% lower than last year. So there was at least things moving in the right direction in that regard. But let's face it, this is a challenge. And the first time that there is a scandal involving either the police commissioner himself a la Richard Ross, or within the department, and you could go down the list there where an officer, is involved in some sort of a shooting of a civilian, and it's pretty clear that there's something went terribly wrong.
Mhm.
Then it all kind of starts to unravel sometimes for these guys, and you really see what kind of leadership they have.
Okay. Your thoughts on Kevin Bethel? I know Kevin for a long time. He was a deputy commissioner. There he is right there under Charles Ramsey. There was a captain before that in narcotics and some other strike force efforts. A true character, this guy, in terms of, he's just top shelf in my book. He leaves nothing unprepared. He always has a plan. He knows how to move things forward. He knows positive thinking, those kind of things. To be honest with you, I think he was the perfect choice for the job out of all the people she was looking at. And she looked quasi across the country
Mhm.
at different people. But Kevin knows the department. He knows the city. He's from here. And he knows, I think, from talking to him a couple times on this show and then chatting with him a few weeks ago before the election, he knows where he wants to go if he was the choice, and he is the choice now. She has said she wants to hit the ground running like the first week and kind of a all hands on deck thing on crime. Your thoughts on Kevin Bethel to begin with, and what does she have to do in tandem with him coming in the door the first week of January?
Well, for one thing, obviously the resume, as you say, the resume is obviously there. This is a guy with both broad experience, but also specifically a knowledge of the city of Philadelphia. You can debate and it gets debated every time when a new mayor comes in, who's going to be the police commissioner choice. And, you could argue this either way. Do you need to look outside the city? Two of the commissioners who, at least generally speaking, got pretty high marks in this city, I would argue, John Timoney and Charles Ramsey, were both folks from outside the city. But we've
Mhm.
had some police commissioners from within the city who've done a very good job as well. The good news for Kevin Bethel is obviously the learning curve is rather short. This
Mhm.
is not a situation like a Danielle Outlaw where you had to say, all right, where's this street, where's this neighborhood located? You know this stuff going in, and so there's not the learning curve. You can hit the ground running. But I think the first thing that both of them have to do in tandem is to improve the relationship between the police department and the neighborhoods and the community that they're policing. And that is a heavy lift. There's
Mhm.
no question about it. If you had told me, for example, 15 years ago when we started to see security cameras on every front stoop and on every building, if you had told me that they were going to have relatively little impact on crime, I would have told you you're crazy. Boy,
Mhm.
we've now got video evidence of all these things going on. It should be a not the silver bullet per se, but should
Right.
help us fight crime dramatically. Well, corresponding with that technology came this loss, slowly but surely, this loss of trust between the community and the police departments around the country, not just in Philadelphia.
Mhm.
And so when there's not that trust, when people don't come forward, or when they come forward initially but then don't show up for trial,
Right.
then then you got a hard road to hoe as a police department. So
Yeah.
they've got to work on that first and foremost. And all it takes, unfortunately, as I said a moment ago, one bad shooting, right? One police involved shooting that looks bad can unravel an awful lot of hard work. But the
Mm.
first thing they've got to do is get that relationship built and maintained between the department and the folks that they actually serve.
Yeah, and to stack up on top of that, I will say this: Kevin, because he is the chief of police, chief of school police, um, has a relationship at a lot of these schools with with the community. So I think he starts with that plus as well. He does have his
Sure.
kind of finger on the pulse in the different communities that you need to be, keep a close eye on, that kind of thing. And he knows
Yeah.
people in those communities. So I think that's a plus for him. I also think he needs to kind of reassure the men and women of the police department that he has their back when they act within the Constitution and do their job. I actually think
Yeah.
he needs to go around to every district in the city in the first month, even if he spends 10 minutes there, and talk to the men and women of the police department and reassure them that this is a new day. This is a better day. And my intention is to make this department better. And I want you to come along with me to do that. And because
Yeah.
I think there are police officers out there now that are afraid to do their job because they're afraid of this district attorney, and that this district attorney will take every opportunity to prosecute them. Um, I'm not saying that's the real, but that's their impression. So I
yeah,
think,
and sometimes perception is reality. Yeah.
yeah, and I think he has to restore confidence among the men and women of the police department. If he can do those two things rather quickly with a nice plan to kind of attack some of the gun violence in the city, I think he gets off to a good start.
Yeah, no question about it. And look, it's an incredibly difficult balancing act, no doubt about it. You mentioned Larry Krasner. On the other side of that balance, on the other side of that scale, the
Mm,
criticism against, say, a Lynn Abraham, who was the district attorney for many years, was that she rarely, if ever, went after police officers, even when their conduct seemed iffy at best. And
right.
so he's got to figure out that balancing act. As I said, you want the relationship with the community, but you also need the backing of your own people, because if you don't have that, it all falls apart anyway.
Yeah.
And so that is a tough ask of anybody, to say, make sure that your folks know they have your back, that you have their back, but it's got to be done right. And if it
Yeah.
isn't done right, there will be consequences. That's what the community wants to hear.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear this police commissioner is going to be beholden to his officers, and whatever they do is A-OK with him. That's not what the community wants to hear. But his members have to know that when they do the job right, and if there's a question, they're gonna get at least a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, and they're not automatically going to be assumed to have done something wrong.
Yeah. And I think Cherelle Parker has to deal with this issue. They're down 1,200 cops in the police department. They need to
Yeah,
add police, and they need to add them quickly. That is difficult to do. It's a 9-month training course before you can become a police officer. You have to pass all these tests: psychological, driving, all that stuff, physical. That's not easy to fill 1,200 jobs in a hurry. And you got to come up with the money to do that, the cheese. If that's not possible, it's going to be difficult to kind of make a big plan work. So her
right.
end of it, I think, is to sit down with Kevin. Here's a plan. I will do everything I can with city council, and we'll get to that in a minute, to get the funding we need to make this better, to build this department back up to where it needs to be. Because I have, in my days in the streets of Philadelphia, in the communities every day, people weren't telling me we want less cops. They were telling me we want more cops, but they
Sure.
want cops who do the job the right way and constitutionally. So her,
Well,
I
and
think,
that's
balancing act is money here, I think, a
yeah.
little bit, to add those bodies.
Yeah, no question about it. And the other element to all of this, of course, again, you want to get these cops on the beat. You want to get them out on the street. What you cannot afford to do is lower the standards for becoming an officer
Yep.
to the point where you're getting folks on the force who should not be on the force. Let's be very candid about all this. This is an
Mm.
incredibly difficult job. The
Yep.
pay is, depending on your perspective, pretty good. No one's getting rich becoming a police officer.
No.
It's you're not going to be living in poverty, but you're not going to get rich being a police officer, even if you're able to work your way up the ranks a fair ways. It is obviously an incredibly dangerous job. You're not always going to have the community's backing. You're not always going to have the district attorney's backing, and that, again, that debate's been going on now for a number of years.
Yeah.
But it's an incredibly difficult job. You cannot simply lower standards to get the numbers in and then say, hooray for me as the mayor, I got 1,200 new officers in. Well, that's great. But if 200 of those 1,200 have no business being police officers, now you've created more problems than you've solved.
Yeah. And interesting, I'd pay money to be a fly on the wall when Larry Krasner, Cherelle Parker, and Kevin Bethel sit down for the first time and try to hold hands here going forward, doing this right. There's a lot
Yeah,
of
that
power.
relationship hasn't been right for quite some time
No,
now.
and there's a lot of power in that room.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we all know Larry likes to think he's the smartest guy in the room every time. So will he step back from that and work with the new mayor? Will he work with the new police commissioner? I'm going to say at the beginning he does. I don't think he wants to be seen as the bad guy here. I think he's had enough of that. I think he's had enough of that, frankly, the way he's been the last few months and the last year, I'd say. And look, he stands up there now when it's a good case and doesn't mind saying he's going to be tough on the individual that they have evidence on. He did it the other day with the Fairmount Park rapist situation. He was very strong at that news conference and talking about that. So that's another difficult thing to watch. She also made some promises, Bruce. I want to change gears a little bit on the schools. Talk to me about what she said she wanted to do with the schools, and can she do that?
Well, on the campaign trail, there was this notion floated of sort of a year-round school, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And, look, when you look around the world at how various countries handle their public school systems, it's not a secret that the U.S. is not the model that people want to follow. In many countries, if not most countries, the school year is longer, the expectations are higher. Now you can argue that the money is at least better allocated, or more of it, or some combination of more money, better allocation of funds in some of these other countries. But it is frankly an embarrassment that a country that is as wealthy as this one doesn't have better results out of its public schools. And then, of course, then you get into the issue of charter schools and private and parochial schools and so forth. And that's its own debate, perhaps for another day. But I don't, that's one of those things that sounds great on a campaign trail. The idea, the logistics of making that happen would be monumental. Absolutely monumental. And quite frankly, just to take one element of that issue,
right,
to say to a school teacher, now your year has completely changed. Now you've got a full year-round schedule. And, I know some teachers, and they will tell you that this notion of, we work only 9 months a year, then we have 3 months off, and it's this perfect scenario. Well, the marketplace will tell you if it's such a perfect scenario, and districts around the country are having a hard time filling teaching positions.
Yeah.
So if this was such a cushy, spectacularly easy job, you would see folks lining up to want to do it. There are no lines of folks waiting to do this job.
No, there aren't.
So that's just one element, and obviously working with the teachers union to make that happen. That in itself seems like a virtually unrealistic hurdle to have to climb. Yeah. So I don't know that happens. I mean, we also know, for example, that the facilities in the city of Philadelphia, the school facilities, are hopelessly out of date. I mean, just the kind of money that would be necessary to repair and renovate and bring up to standards dozens and dozens of buildings, the vast majority of which are at least 70, 80, 90 years old, that predate modern electrical facilities, and the air conditioning system, if there is one, is antiquated, and most of them don't have one. It's a mess just for the physical plant involved. So she's got her work cut out. And the one thing I would say is she has a relationship, because of her work in the state legislature prior to becoming mayor. She does have some relationships in Harrisburg.
That's what I was going to ask you about. Yeah.
Democratic governor, and a little more control, at least in the House, a razor-thin majority for Democrats. So it's not perhaps quite as hostile a relationship as it might have been for someone else. So at least she's got that going for her. But again, another massively heavy lift.
Okay, quick city council. We have an entirely new city council, basically. Some older figures who've been there a little bit, but now there's a whole new face on city council. There's a new city council president. There will be working relationships for her with that. Talk to me a little bit about that, and how does she need to get that off on the right foot right away?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned lots and lots of newcomers, and at the other end of the spectrum, you have Brian O'Neill in the 10th district, the lone now Republican in the council. He's the lone Republican in council now. There used to be 3 of the 17 were Republicans, and now the 2 who were at-large council people have been beaten in their elections by the Working Families Party. And
David
so
O left to run for mayor. Yeah.
Right. So Brian O'Neill, who's basically been around since Ben Franklin, is the lone Republican there. So one would think, if you looked at it from the outside, my goodness, you've got 16 out of 17 Democrats. So you're a Democrat. So why shouldn't you be able to get anything passed that you want to? Well, it doesn't work that way. And frankly, it has never worked that way. Each mayor has to forge their own relationship with some of these folks. Everybody's got their own problems in their own districts. You've got 10 district council people. All of these districts have different issues. Drug use may be massively a problem in one district and not so much in another. Street crime in one district and not so much in another. Infrastructure in one district, not so much in another. And you've got to navigate that. And for example, a mayor like Michael Nutter, who had some successes certainly during his 2 terms, but wound up with a relationship in city council that was not so good. In fact, it was terrible at points. And so there's no guarantee that just because you have an overwhelmingly Democrat city council, you're going to be able to get through whatever you want. You've got to have a good working relationship with the council president. We assume.
And who is that going to be, Bruce?
It looks like Kenyatta Johnson, I believe. The last time I checked, looks like that he would be the guy. with Darrell Clark retiring from council after a long stint as council president. And so it's all about relationships. As you know, politics is all about relationships. You know, you don't have to worry as much about the party situation, as I said, but that doesn't mean you get whatever you want. And you know, especially you've got to get whatever you're going to get done. You got to get it done relatively early, certainly first term, because I will tell you that once you get into a second term, and especially the second half of a second term, you know, we talk about mayors having basically in Philadelphia an 8-year term of office, right? 2 4-year terms. Anybody who wants to get reelected is going to get reelected. You get toward that latter stage of the second term, half of council is eyeing running for themselves, and they're less interested in making your plans work and more interested in getting on television with whatever they have to say about things. Obviously, council is now the pipeline to the mayor's office. You had, you know, John Street, then Michael Nutter, then Jim Kenney. All of these folks came from council to the mayor's office.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring up with you your thoughts on Jim Kenney. 8 years in office. I'm interested, and this is kind of a surprise. I didn't ask you about it beforehand, but what kind of grade you'd give him as a mayor? And 2, what's his legacy and how is he remembered kind of going forward? And maybe 2A, does he go anywhere else politically?
I would be somewhat shocked, frankly, if he went anywhere else politically. Obviously, you had a guy like Ed Rendell as the poster child for flying high as a Philadelphia mayor. Still felt like he had some real work to be done and heights to scale, and went on to become a 2-term governor of Pennsylvania. I don't see that happening. And look, I could obviously be surprised. I don't see that happening with Jim Kenney. I don't know that it's something he'd be interested in. For one thing, once you've been the chief executive, once you've been the executive officer in one setting or another, the idea of being a legislator, for example, you know, would he run for being a state legislator or a member of Congress or whatever? It's a lot of these guys will tell you, once you've been the boss, being one of a large group is not nearly as enticing as it might seem. There are big business opportunities for him and so forth. So that's kind of what I would expect. But to your larger question, I think he's a fascinating example of the reality and the perception being 2 different things. Look, his work getting the soda tax, the sweetened beverage tax passed, with that money going toward rec centers and pre-K facilities. The Inquirer in Philadelphia has done really a good job, I think, of in-depth reporting on those projects. And to be sure, in both cases, whether it's rec centers or pre-K, the promises were not all fulfilled, in part because there was so much pushback to that sweetened beverage tax, so many lawsuits, so much time, effort, and money spent just trying to defend the tax in the first place, that getting the money, getting it off the ground, and getting shovels in the ground became a lot tougher than a lot of people thought it was going to be, or certainly than he thought. So, but the bottom line is, I think those are both important programs, and that's not a bad legacy to have rec centers and pre-K programs that you got in there. The other side of the coin is the perception. And I just don't think that the perception matches the reality in his case. And that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. Jim Kenney, I knew him pretty well, covered him extensively in council. And he was sort of the guy, he was the go-to guy for a lot of reporters to talk about what was going on in the mayor's office, especially as he had more and more critiques of the Nutter administration before he announced his own run. But I just think the personality type was frankly wrong for the job. And I don't want to play nickel psychologist, but there was a certain dourness and melancholy about his personality that was just perhaps out of sync with that job. Ed Rendell famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, to do this job, you've got to be something of a cheerleader, right? And that's not a mindless, you know, that's not an insult. You've got to be a cheerleader to tell people what's great about your city and why it's a wonderful place and so forth. You've got to screw that smile on and go out in public and talk things up, even when you don't feel like it. And that, I never got the sense that Jim Kenney was comfortable in that role. Even relatively early on, I have vivid recollections of him in a pre-K environment, and we're all sitting on these little undersized chairs in the pre-K room. And even there, where this was clearly a signature accomplishment of his, right? This was the soda tax, creating the funding to get these places expanded and so forth. Barely a smile on his face, even in that scenario. He just, I don't think he was particularly comfortable with that aspect of the job. And of course, there was the politically fatal comment that he made relatively late in the second term about
Yeah, that's where I
essentially
was going to go.
saying
Yeah,
he'd be more than happy when he no longer had to worry about having that job. And he said it in the context of literally every time the phone rings, is this a police officer who's been shot and killed? Is this some natural disaster? Is this a road collapse that killed some people? Is, one thing after another. And there's no question that thinking about being mayor and running for mayor and being mayor elect, as I said before, is one thing. Once they give you the keys to the car, it's a tough road to hoe.
yeah,
And I think he will be, he doesn't want, nobody wants to have it said about them that they didn't care, that they weren't, fully invested in the job. Somehow, sadly, his body language and some of his comments suggested that it's not really what he wanted to be doing. And
yeah.
I suspect that privately, he will be thrilled when January rolls around.
Yeah, and like you, to me, it's two different people. The guy I covered in city council, the go-to guy for a soundbite on a police matter or a fire department matter, was a strong, interested, forward-thinking guy, candid. To me, there was none of that in the past 8 years. And I'm not trying to criticize him. I kind of feel for him a little bit. I just don't think he was up to the job. I mean, this job is a very difficult job to do. And no one's saying it's not. And I give him credit for sticking it out and going and doing 8 years. And listen, the guy's a nice guy. But the problem here, I just think, is the guy that was in city council and the guy in the mayor's office were, to me, two different people. And I'm hearing that from people in the street, too.
Yeah,
I mean,
and very clearly that, and I saw this both with Kenney and his predecessor, Michael Nutter, being the guy, and I'm being a little glib here, but being the guy as the city council person who is in the back of the room, the back of the classroom, shooting spitballs at the teacher up front, who's the mayor, that's the easy part. And then they say to you, okay, now you're the teacher. And now everybody's shooting spitballs at you or worse. Yeah. And so that shift from Councilman Nutter to Mayor Nutter, from Councilman Kenney to Mayor Kenney, that's a big shift. And again, I just don't think the personality type was necessarily suited for that kind of a job. And it's, look, I thought he was a fundamentally decent guy. I absolutely think he cared. Absolutely. But the body language and some of the comments suggested otherwise. And once that impression is put in place, man, it hardens like cement, and you are hard pressed to change that narrative.
Yeah. Listen, also, before we go, Bruce, I'll give you a chance to make a quick comment, and then we're going to let you go. I know you have to be somewhere. Your thoughts on the loss of the pilot and photographer in that Channel 6 helicopter this past week. We've all flown in news choppers before. I did it many times, many years at Channel 10. I did it many times. I sat over Citizens Bank Park when the Phillies won the World Series in the helicopter. This is so horrible, so terrible. And I just want to give our thoughts and prayers to everybody at Channel 6, the families of the two gentlemen who were involved in the crash and passed away, unfortunately. And I just want to give you a chance to make the final comment here, if I could.
Yeah, I would just say, and I did a lot more helicopter flying back some years ago in the earlier part of my career, notably when I was in St. Louis. And back in those days, in the 80s, a lot of the guys who were flying, these were former Vietnam helicopter pilots. And so you always felt like they could handle whatever was going to come their way. And these guys are incredibly skilled, incredibly talented, and incredibly serious people. They understand that, they're in a big machine up there, 1,000 feet up. It has absolutely no business flying. And so they do a heck of a job. And the idea that you would lose your life doing this is obviously horrific and tragic. It's another reminder, though, that folks who do this kind of work for a living, their goal is to bring information to people. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable work. Sometimes it can be dangerous work. And in this case, these are two gentlemen who lost their lives doing it. And it's just tremendously sad. And I hope folks realize that while there are many criticisms of the media that are perfectly justified, at its base and at its core and at their core, the people who do this kind of thing for a living, they do it because they're trying to help people. That's the biggest thing they're doing it for, the biggest reason, because the vast majority of folks doing this are not going to get rich, but they're doing it for the right reasons. And it's just, it's a terrible shame. This time of year, even worse, but obviously there is no time of year when it's less horrible for something like this to happen.
Okay. Didn't mean to end on a somber note, but I felt like we should comment. You and I both have been in this situation, in this business for a long time, and it's a real shame. I feel for everybody out there, especially the families of the two gentlemen involved and the Channel 6 family. We're different stations and competing stations, but we're all one in the business, and I appreciate that. Bruce, again, stellar performance today, my friend. I appreciate it. I wish you a happy new year in 2024. Thanks for coming on the show, and we'll do many more shows in 2024 with you, I hope.
You got it. Same to you, Dave. Always a pleasure, and we'll chat soon.
All right, brother. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. That's the Philly Prime podcast for this week. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.